Oh.
So I've started the recording, and we are talking about 2 Corinthians tonight. But one of the questions that kind of conversations came up as we were gathering is the role of women throughout history. And there have been some archaeology starting to find that our story, the narrative that we tell today, that women didn't have rights in the past and have never had rights, actually is probably not true. And that there were cultures in the past where women were considered equal to men as well, and powerful cultures as well. Even in Egypt, we have women who are sitting on the throne. We have in the New Testament, we have stories of there's women that are being named who are the ones who are underwriting the ministry that is happening. So we have wealthy women that they are getting this wealth from somewhere. They have authority, they have power, and they are contributing and making the choice to contribute these funds in a way using their own values in their own belief system, meaning that they have agency as well. And we don't tell that story as often. And it's especially interesting reading in the letters, because parts of the letters, as we talked about last week, have been used to tell women that, as Camille said, the women have a place, they're beneath the thumb of the man. And that's how we used these letters in the New Testament, which is probably a very big misrepresentation of how Paul was talking about women, how women were what role they did have, and what authority and agency and place they had in the ministry within the early church, and what role and authority place women can grow to have in the future as well. So that's I know I was talking with, it's not been that long ago that major denominations in the US were telling women, no, like there will never be women ordained. And the UCC goes back a lot farther. We've been ordaining women for a long time, but other denominations have not. And so and we still have many that do not. So it's an interesting place to be in. Well, 2 Corinthians, what were your thoughts? Initial thoughts jumping into 2 Corinthians.
Well, I had a couple of verses that kind of struck out to me. The first was in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. For we do not preach ourselves, Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves merely as your bondservants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," is the one who has shown in our hearts to give us light for the knowledge of the glory and majesty of God, clearly revealed in the face of Christ. He definitely indicates, hey, I'm not here for my own self-aggrandizement. I am here to, I'm here for you, to preach to you good news of Jesus that God has revealed. And I found it very interesting in chapter 7. He addresses the previous letter that he wrote to them. This is chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. For even though I did grieve you with my letter, I do not regret it now, though I did regret it, for I see that the letter hurt you, though only for a little while. Yet I am glad now, not because you were hurt and made sorry, but because your sorrow led to repentance, and you turned back to God, for you felt a grief such as God meant for you to feel, so that you might not suffer loss in anything on our account. I thought that indicated that maybe he wrote something previously, and he knew afterwards that it was gonna sting, And he was sorry that it stung, but he was glad about their recognizing it and working through it. And the third thing that I had really pointed out was actually a footnote for chapter 9, verses 6 through 8 on giving. There is no better indicator of growth in the new life than in the area of giving. This passage and others deal with several aspects of giving. Giving should be done generously, even extravagantly. Giving should be done cheerfully, should be regular, systematic, proportionate. God is not primarily concerned about the amount of the gift, but with the motive which lies behind it. The person who fails to honor God with his money actually robs God, not because it impoverishes God, but because it denies the God-ordained means for the support of his work and his ministers. For the child of God who honors God with his money, God promises abundant blessing and the provision of his every need. Those three things really stuck out to me. Paul is telling us, I came here to preach the good news to you, not for me, but for you. And I'm sorry I hurt you, but I'm glad that you have repented and turned back once again, and how important it is to support the ministry, the spread of this good news. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm done.
And that piece of supporting the ministry, that it's throughout Paul's letter, he's saying this isn't about me, that this is about you as well. And in giving, the act of generosity also transforms the giver. And so it's even that act is about to donate and to be a donor is about our relationship and our where we are in life, and the living out of our dreams and values. Where we put our money is where our dreams and values are as well.
But somewhere in this chapter, it also has that famous phrase, God loves a cheerful giver.
Yeah, that's in 9:7. Each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God, and then on 8, and God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. And Paul he's a fundraiser too. That's how he's funding the ministry that he's doing, and that's how the church is. But he's not a fundraiser to raise money. He is raising money, but he's a fundraiser because funds are a part of our spiritual lives, and money's a part of that. And so he's trying to move them into a mindset of abundance, because you can't be generous truly unless you have this mindset of abundance as well.
I was surprised also that he said you don't give out of what you need for your necessities, but you give out of your what do we call it today, your available funds for spending it on whatever you want.
Your discretionary fund.
There you go. Yes.
What I got, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm listening.
No, I was just saying, the thing that struck me so much about this particular chapter and all the things with Paul is, without Paul, I don't know where our religion would have been. Paul was he really spread that everywhere. Or would it have just been a little religion in one part of the country, one part of the world?
Well, there were other apostles that definitely spread the word in other areas of the world. In fact, I think there were 2 that were supposedly in Africa, and I can't remember which 2. But they
Well, the one-
supposedly
I
have a
didn't know
relic.
that. I didn't know that,
One
but
of
I
those
didn't,
churches has a relic of one of the saints, one of the original.
well, I think I did remember that.
Mhm.
But I just hadn't realized what a big part Paul played in the,
Oh, yeah.
you know, in carrying this word out and on.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, he did play a big part. And he was
Huge.
careful at the same time to say, I'm not the only one doing this, that
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
helping to spread the word, but so are you. There were a number of early Christians who would have been travelers or traveling merchants who also would have been part of
Okay.
spreading the word. And then you'd have the other apostles who were spreading as well. But none of it was about, and Jesus said this multiple times too, it's not about me. Like, it's not about any single being, any single one of us, that this is about God, and all things that we do should point that way.
Mhm.
Another thing, Camille, that you had picked up on your second point, that about the letter hurting
Yeah.
them and writing about that. So
Mhm.
an important piece that you picked up on with that is that this is, we read 1 Corinthians, now we're reading 2 Corinthians, but
Mhm.
there aren't just two letters to the people of Corinth. There were
Yeah.
other letters that are being written as well. We
Mhm.
just have two of the letters. And that
Mhm.
was one of the references where Paul is referencing to other letters that he has sent to this community. And this was a community, remembering that Paul started, a community that would have been near and dear to his heart, a community that he stayed and he lived with them for about a year and a half as they were starting. And so when you're working with, this is like his child that he's birthed into the world in some ways. And so he would have had more than just these two letters in multiple communications and wanting the best for them as well throughout this time.
Well, it's not hard though to think of it in response to 1 Corinthians, because 1 Corinthians is where he is taking them to task for the deviations that definitely detract from the good news, that they're not walking the walk. They might be talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk, and they're improperly judging one another, and they're mixing with the non-believers, and they've got controversies about idols. And I think he was pretty stern in many of those areas and spelling it out. So I had no problem saying, oh yeah, this definitely reflects back. And I'm sure that if he had other letters, they most likely reiterated what he had in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah. And
What is the third heaven? You know,
Oh,
in
yeah.
Paul's visions and Revelations,
Oh yeah,
chapter
Oh,
12.
yeah. Paul had referred to that a man
14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven, whether body or in body or out of body, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
just something else that was going on there, or what? What is that? What is the third heaven?
so it seems that Paul, it seems, had some mystical experiences that are beyond explanation, beyond rational.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
so that's one way that sometimes that's read, that he does have these mystical experiences that are occurring. That's my dog.
Okay.
I apologize.
I've got an interesting explanation of that as a footnote. And this is from the Amplified Bible. Let's see. Where is it? Third heaven. It was common to speak of three heavens. The first is the atmosphere where the birds fly. The second is the place of the sun, moon, and stars. The third is where God lives.
Okay.
So
That even correlates a little with what their knowledge of the universe was then.
Probably, yeah, probably.
You know, the other stuff we're reading.
Mhm. I am quickly going to another version. See if it has anything.
Yeah, as
Say.
you move up the heavens in Paul's explanation that things are better as you move up these
Mhm.
layers of heaven.
I didn't know where the statement or concept of for the sake of Christ, for whenever I am weak, then I am strong. I've heard that in church and ministers use it, and I didn't know that's where this came from. I always liked that.
Mhm. Oh, I have a different version. And the footnote says, I know a man. It's an oblique reference to himself. Maybe he was referring to the road to Damascus. I don't know. But interesting to see what different writers say about the same text.
There was also an idea that some people believe there were 7 layers to heaven. And so you would have these 7 heavens, and as you moved up through the heavens, you would get closer to God. So in this 3rd heaven, that's higher up, but not all the way up to level 7. John said it was probably after one of his beatings, and that may have been that he had some mystical experience at that point. And so he was this. You also would have had other false prophets at this time who are relating mystical experiences of their own. And so then Paul is sharing his own experiences as well to try to add more credibility and to show like it's not like don't listen to these false prophets is a part of what he's doing too.
That also brings up chapter 13, where he kind of, I warn you now, you know, if I come again, I won't be lenient since you desire proof.
What verses are you in?
Chapter 13, the whole beginning first.
Oh.
He's kind of angry that, you know, he's saying, this is the 3rd time I've come here. And I've warned those who sinned previously and all the others. I warn you now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Desiring proof that Christ is speaking to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Well, we saw in 1 Corinthians there were divisions happening, and they were trying to decide, well, which teacher's the best? Which one should we be following? And Paul reprimands them and says, none of them. You should be following Jesus. That that's not what's most important. And so it seems to be continuing and getting a stronger hold here in 2 Corinthians. Well, let's walk through some of this book here, and then we'll watch the Bible Project recording. We'll do a brief kind of overview, and then we'll be able to jump into the Bible Project. So we've got 2 Corinthians. We have chapters 1 through 7 are probably one letter. So they seem to be just the way they're structured, that's definitely part of one letter.
Mm-hmm.
And within this, we have some interesting things that are happening. We have over in chapter 1, there's this part here around 19. I'm sorry, chapter 1, verse 23. But I call on God as witness against me. It was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. It seemed that Paul maybe intended to come, but then changed his mind there. And so there were some other other visits that may have been planned but were changed. Then we get going into chapter 3, we're getting this image of ministry in chapter 3. Sorry, I told my dog no and then
He's fine.
she
Yeah.
barked quieter.
The only person on the screen right now that is bothered is you.
Yeah, that's right.
She thinks the door will open if she barks at it, it seems.
That's a commonality.
Okay.
So we've got in this chapter 3, we're getting an imagery of ministry, and this is all throughout, goes all the way through chapter 4 and continuing some of the pieces from chapter 3. And we get this, so this image of ministry that we're getting in these, that ministry is a letter written on our hearts in chapter 3. In chapter 4, we get that ministry is treasure in clay jars. And then in chapter 5, we are getting that ministry is an earthly tent. These main themes there. At the end of chapter 6, there's this aside that seems to be inserted in to the letter. So it's chapter 6, verses 14 through 7:1. It seems to be an aside that's been inserted in because the letter actually flows best if you took that out. And you went from chapter 6, verse 13 to chapter 7, verse 2. That flows really well with the writing. And so this seems to be something that is added in and maybe not part of the original letter. Then we're coming up on chapter 10. Chapter 10 through 13 seems to be another letter.
Ah, okay.
So 2 Corinthians is not just one letter. We think that 2 Corinthians is actually multiple letters that have been curated together.
Okay.
In chapter 10 through 13, that letter is pretty harsh. As you were reading it, one, it's a harsher, more of an attacking tone. The tone is different in this section than it is in the earlier sections.
He seems to be somewhat angry too.
Yeah.
We also get this that chapter 11, verse 3. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. It seems there seem to be some outsiders that are coming into the church, which we hear a little bit about that they're following different people, allusions to it. But this is a little more direct that Paul is talking about here. I think that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles, which is an interesting text. It reminds me a little bit of maybe like TV evangelism that only that takes advantage of people, that we have some TV evangelism that just really tries to get money out of people and isn't actually about the gospel. And maybe that it seems maybe things were like that were happening in the early church too.
Well, and then he even goes on further to say that even Satan disguises himself as the angel of light. So it's not strange if his ministers are disguising themselves as ministers, their end will match their deeds. You know, that was pretty in your face.
Yeah, and then we have Paul does a bit of a boast here in chapter 11, verse 25. 5 times I have received 40 lashes minus 1. And
what does that mean? Minus 1.
Then 39.
Yep.
Well, why wouldn't he say 39? Or was 40?
40 sounds like more.
Okay.
Like you say, it was only almost a million. It's
Yeah.
like
I
a
just
little
wondered
less.
if 40, I had wondered if 40 wasn't like the common number that they did. And so instead of having 40, he didn't get all 40, he only got 39. I didn't know.
Yeah, well, there is a reference back. So 40 is also a number that's very important in the Bible and
Yeah.
really references to a lot is what
Mhm.
40 means.
Mhm.
Okay.
We don't know that 40 actually means 40 in the Bible. Like, was it 40 days and 40 nights that it rained on earth, or was it just a really long time in the story of Noah in the ark? Was it 40 days that Jesus went without food and water in the wilderness, or was it just a really long time?
John put up something.
John wrote they were allowed 40, but did 39, so they didn't go over 40.
Okay.
There's also this reference here back to Deuteronomy. This is where where it comes from, where you're allowed to do 40 is if you go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3. It says this: 40 lashes may be given, but not more. If more lashes than these are given, your neighbor will be degraded in your sight. So you were not to give more than those 40. So they made sure, you did not go over.
What's all the stuff about being necessary to boast on 12?
So Paul's talking about that these super apostles are boasting, and they're doing all of this boasting. And so Paul is saying, if I'm going to boast, the things I'm going to boast about are the things that point to Jesus. The things these super apostles boast about must have been things that were pointing to themselves.
Okay, I wondered about that.
Yeah, because he says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness, instead of saying, like, I'm going to boast about how great I am, which it seems
Okay,
like these
gotcha.
super apostles.
Yeah, that makes sense. He says, therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, messenger of Satan.
Yeah. So Paul is trying to say, here are some signs of an authentic ministry. He's mad about these super apostles, and we hear that, but he's also trying to give them signs of how do you recognize an authentic minister.
This whole chapter makes Paul come more to life as, being a child and doing all this. I've taken all this pretty much for granted growing up, that this happened and this was all done through God and all of, and everything. But this really brings it back to, it was difficult, and what they were doing out there, was difficult. And he says, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. I mean, it really brings it home.
Yeah. And it really, like, how hard it is, how much they struggle to figure out what is the message we're trying to convey here. Because you have in the early church, like with any budding movement and organization, what is our purpose? What is our mission? What is our vision? How are we going to live into this? And you have this movement spreading, and you can't control that. How do you figure out how to get a unified body with one another?
Did you see what John put up?
Yeah, John put, this book has more personal stuff about Paul than any other.
Mhm.
We see Paul's personality, I think, come out in this one. Personality and what's happening to him too.
Well, in 13, he really gets into that,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I won't be lenient. I won't,
People say a lot when they're mad.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's what I got. I thought he's really mad or something. Let's see. I didn't see what John said that time.
John said maybe because of the attacks against him in that
Yeah.
movie.
Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into the Bible project here. And they're going to go over the structure. So let's get this up. There we go.
Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Even though it's called 2nd or 2 Corinthians in our Bibles, there are multiple clues within this letter that it's not the second thing he ever wrote to the church of ancient Corinth. Paul started this Jesus community in Corinth some time ago. On one of his missionary journeys, you can read the story in the book of Acts, chapter 18. And after moving on, Paul got a report that things were not going well there. So he wrote the letter that we call 1 Corinthians to correct these problems. And it appears that many in the church rejected Paul's teaching in that letter and rebelled against his authority. And so we learn in this letter that Paul had followed up in person with what he calls the painful visit. And after that, he sent a letter which he says was written with anguish and tears. And so after all these measures, most, but not all of the Corinthians realized their arrogance and they apologized to Paul. They wanted to reconcile. And so Paul wrote this letter to assure them of his love and commitment. The letter's been designed with 3 main sections, each addressing a distinct topic. So Paul first finalizes his reconciliation with the Corinthians. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the topic of forgotten generosity. And in the final chapters, Paul challenges the remaining Corinthians who still reject him. Let's dive in and you'll see how it all works. So Paul opens up by thanking the God of all mercy and comfort, who brought peace and encouragement to him and the Corinthians during this time of division and dispute. He acknowledges that things have been tense since this painful visit, and he makes clear he's forgiven them. He wants an open and honest relationship. But why had they rejected Paul in the first place? Well, we discover later in this letter that the Corinthians had disregarded Paul as a leader. He was poor, he earned a meager living through manual labor, he was under constant persecution and suffering, he was often homeless, and to top it off, he wasn't a very impressive public speaker. And so once the Corinthians were exposed to other, more wealthy, impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul. They were actually ashamed of him. So Paul responds first by showing that their elevation of these leaders, simply because of their wealth and eloquence, is a betrayal of Jesus. It shows a totally distorted value system. True Christian leadership, Paul says, is not about status or self-promotion. Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who's leading them on a procession of triumph. Paul's job isn't to be impressive, but rather to point people to the one who is Jesus. He then alludes to the recent demand of the Corinthians that he provide some letters of recommendation to prove his authority and credentials, and this is ridiculous to Paul. Their church wouldn't even exist if he hadn't started it, and so he says they are his proof of genuine leadership. They are his letter of recommendation. He cleverly quotes from the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, saying that God's Spirit has written his letter of recommendation on their hearts as his new covenant people. The Corinthians shouldn't need any more proof than that. Now, the mention of the new covenant, it leads Paul into a long comparison between the old covenant between God and Israel that was mediated by Moses and the new covenant between God and the Corinthians mediated by Jesus and the Spirit. The old covenant made at Mount Sinai, it was truly glorious. It made Moses himself shine with God's glory, but that glory eventually faded. Not to mention the fact that the laws of that covenant were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. But the new covenant, by comparison, is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the very glory of God and he lives on forever. And it's his Spirit that's now transforming people to become more faithful, just like Jesus himself. Now, this all sounds amazing. I mean, who doesn't want to share in God's own glory? But Paul goes on to show how the paradox of the cross turns upside down the Corinthians' ideas of glory and success. After all, Jesus' glorious exaltation as king took place through his suffering, execution, and death. On the cross, Jesus revealed God's salvation. He died for the sins of the world to reconcile people to God, but the cross does even more. It reveals God's character. He's a being of utter self-giving, suffering love that seeks the well-being of others. The cross also reveals a new cruciform way of life, and Paul's goal is that his life and ministry imitates the cross. So although his apostolic career, it's been marked by humility, suffering, by poverty, it was all to serve the Corinthians. And so when they disapprove of Paul's poverty and suffering, they disapprove of Jesus too. Paul's way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. Paul really wants to reconcile with the Corinthians, but he won't let things lie until they've been transformed and embrace this upside-down paradox of the cross. After this passionate appeal, Paul moves on to address the topic of forgotten generosity. So the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem, they had fallen into poverty due to a famine. And Paul was raising money among the new churches that he started, full of mostly non-Jews. They would all send a relief gift as a symbol of their unity in the Messiah, Jesus. And so many of his churches, they were thrilled to give, but the Corinthians, in the midst of all this conflict with Paul, hadn't saved up for the gift. And for Paul, this isn't just about money. It's another sign that the Corinthians have not been transformed by the gospel about Jesus, which at its heart is a story of generosity. Paul says, "You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus the Messiah, that even though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." He's telling the story of the gospel through financial metaphors. Jesus gave up his glorious honor or wealth, and he lowered himself to die like a poor slave, so that other people who are impoverished through sin and death can be exalted and become wealthy through the riches of God's grace. To be a Christian is to let this story sink deep into your mind and heart, letting it transform you into someone who's more generous, more willing to share your life and resources to help others. In the final section of the letter, Paul focuses on the main source of his conflict with the Corinthians, that group of impressive leaders that he sarcastically calls super apostles. So they came to Corinth promoting themselves and bad-mouthing Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. And at the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says, do these guys really want to compare credentials? He can totally take them on. Are they Jewish Bible experts? Well, so is Paul. He was a Pharisee, for goodness sakes. He has the whole Bible memorized. Do they want to brag about their superior knowledge of Jesus? Paul has actually seen and hung out with the risen Jesus. He's actually had visions of Jesus' heavenly throne room. But more importantly, Paul has given his entire life to the mission of Jesus. He sacrificed comfort and stability, and he never asked the Corinthians for money. Unlike the super apostles who charged a lot, Paul earned his own living. But, Paul says, he refuses to brag about these accomplishments because these aren't the things that really matter as a Christian. Instead, what he'll brag about is how flawed and how weak he is, because it's in those inadequacies that he discovers the love and mercy of Jesus. Or as Jesus once told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect through weakness." Paul concludes the letter with a sober warning to the Corinthians. They need to check themselves. Their contempt for Paul, his way of life, their love for these super apostles, it all shows that they don't grasp who Jesus is on a fundamental level. They're not living like transformed followers of Jesus, and so he invites them once again to humble themselves before the love of Jesus. 2 Corinthians gives us a really unique window into the life of Paul and the paradox set before us by the cross of Jesus. The cross challenges our values, our ways of seeing the world. We value success, education, wealth, but God values humility and weakness because his love and power were made known through the suffering, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. The cross also unleashes the transforming power and presence of the Spirit to empower Jesus' followers to take up his cruciform way of life and make it their own. And that's what 2 Corinthians is all about.
Elementor presents the web creator.
I don't understand at the beginning where they indicated that Paul was unimpressive, and then they went on to say, well, he's a rabbi or a Pharisee rather. He's obviously well educated. At one point, he tells people if I were speaking to Jews, I became as a Jew, and to the Gentiles as a Gentile, to the Greeks as a Greek, et cetera, et cetera. So what about Paul's preaching was unimpressive?
He didn't have money. He didn't have money and he didn't wear fancy clothes. He didn't drive the right car. He didn't, or have the good wagon.
Gotcha.
He wasn't shiny. The money that he got, he would give away. He didn't use it on himself.
Mhm. I see. And that equates to unimpressive. Okay. Okay.
So we haven't changed much.
Right.
Yep. We like to feel like we're special by a lot of the idols that people were worshiping way back still apply today. And there's
Mhm.
reasons why 1st and 2nd Corinthians are in the Bible. It's not
Mhm.
because these problems were solved by the church. It's because the church still has these problems, and not just the church, but humanity still has these problems.
Mhm. Right.
If they were unrelatable problems, they wouldn't be in the Bible.
Very.
I think it's impressive how there is a lot of evidence that these are different letters that have been curated together. But whoever's done the curating together, the way that they've put it together and the way that the books of the Bible have been put together is incredibly impressive, as far as still having a theme and pulling all of that through.
Gretchen, do you have access to, a while back, they found some new books, probably was 30 years ago in some caves.
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, they found some. I had those books. I had a couple of them and we lost them in the flood. And I'd like to get them back now that we've read the Bible, because they were books that could have, at least the commentator that talked about it said they were books that could have been looked at for going in the Bible.
Yeah.
They were that quality. And have you ever heard of them or?
So I think you could buy, let's see, here's the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. It's like
okay.
$18 on Amazon.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll do that. I didn't even know that was possible. Thanks.
Yeah, so you could find it translated and you could look, probably some of them have just the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then you could also probably find some books that would have commentary with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you can decide what type would best fit you.
I just like to see how they fit in, and
and to see some of the different
pretty much by
writings.
chance that these made it, found at the right time.
And another thing that's interesting is to look at the different writing styles too. And you're looking at some pieces that are not as cleanly curated as well. And to see some of the roughness, we can learn from prophecies or different places as well. It's also interesting to read other writings from the same time period. We saw this when we were studying in the Old Testament, especially the prophets. We were looking at some of the Babylonian prophecies, and there's the formula for a prophecy, what makes something a prophecy, is the same across these different cultures of this area. Yeah, it would be interesting to read some of the other, like the other gospels too. The ones that aren't biblical gospels, but the stories of Christ that were written by different communities. Any other thoughts on 2 Corinthians? Next week, we're gonna jump, next week's Ash Wednesday, actually. So we will not have class on Ash Wednesday. But I'd invite you to join us, whether in person or online, for our Ash Wednesday service. And so Ash Wednesday service, that is at 6 o'clock. So the service is at 6. Bible study, when it resumes, will continue at 6:30. But next Wednesday, that's March 2nd, we have the soup supper at 5. And if you'd like to join us at church, that's from 5 to 5:45, that soup will be available. And then starting at 6, we'll have the Ash Wednesday service, but we won't do Bible study that night.
I think Jane and I are making soup for that.
I think so too.
Jane says it's really good. I thought from the sound of it, I didn't think so, but that's okay.
I'll
Then-
bet it's delicious.
We will jump back into Bible study and the next week. So March 9th, we'll pick back up with Bible study and we'll jump into the book of Galatians. So a letter of Paul to the Galatians. And
Can we do more than one?
well, they are short. Would you like to do more than one?
Well, I wouldn't mind doing 2, Galatians and Ephesians. That's about the length of the ones we're doing now.
Yeah. So all the letters are in order of length, so they're just going to keep getting shorter. So if you'd like, we can do the half on Galatians, half on Ephesians, and have the Bible study project lead us through.
Galatians and Ephesians. Got it.
So we've got
On
1 letters to get
on the 9th at 6:30, right?
on the 9th at 6:30. Yes.
Okay.
And if I'm a little late, still like keep trying to join, because we have centering prayer at the church at 6 on Wednesdays. And so that will run from about 6 to 6:30.
Okay.
And then I'll run to my office and hit start. So it won't be available. I'll figure out maybe a best way so that you're able to join. But if you're not able to join before 6:30 or right at 6:30, please just try again, and then join in.
Okay.
And you're welcome to join us for centering prayer. So we're going to be doing this throughout Lent as our Wednesday services. And if you'd like to come for centering prayer, that we're just going to do centering prayer in person, because it doesn't really work as it's a silent type of prayer. And if you want to join in person, you're welcome to come to the church, and we can have the library set up for people who want to jump into Bible study and do it from the church.
Mhm.
So that would be an option too. We have a new TV that somebody has donated to the church that we can get set up in the library, so that we could run somebody's computer up through that TV, and then you'd be able to join and see it on the big screen there too. So that's how, and so we'll continue with the Bible throughout the season of Lent, and maybe we'll finish them by summer, all the letters
Yep.
Right.
and Revelation.
Good. Good. That'd be
Right.
great.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for doing
you.
this, Gretchen.
Yes,
thank
thank you,
you.
Gretchen.